Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
At my brother's graduation dinner, under those soft amber lamps that turn everyone into a kinder version of themselves, my father stood with a practiced clink of crystal against crystal, lifted his chin in the way he does when he is about to issue a proclamation instead of a toast, and declared, with the perfect pause of a man who thinks he's opening a movie, to the only child worth being proud of, which made the table break into a polite clatter of forks and the kind of applause you hear in hotel ballrooms when people are clapping because they're supposed to, not because they feel anything, and while the waiter smiled with his teeth and my mother dabbed nothing from the corner of her eye, I watched my husband watch my father. And I felt that old childhood heat crawl up my neck the way it used to when I stood next to a trophy that technically belonged to me, but somehow always ended up on my brother's shelf. I am not the dramatic type by nature, though a woman who keeps her invoices alphabetized will be accused of drama by anyone who prefers the world to run on favors, so I will say this plainly and let it bruise where it needs to bruise. Our family trained for decades to perform the ballet of pretending that my brother, Jake, shone on his own. Meanwhile, I learned to vanish on cue and reappear only when someone needed a password, a ride, or a quiet transfer to close a gap that no one wanted to admit existed, which made for a tidy narrative at church and on Facebook and in those holiday letters where the fonts say more about the sender than the sentences do, yet it carved a very specific groove in me. A groove where you can pour anger and it will look like composure. If you need the origin story, it is not spectacular, and maybe that is the problem, because ordinary favoritism can turn into a religion when it goes unchecked. He was the boy who broke curfews and still got pancakes for breakfast because the coach said he had promise, while I was the girl who turned lights off in empty rooms and got told not to be so intense because intensity makes men uncomfortable. And by the time we were grown, I had learned the polite art of leaving before the argument and paying before the bill arrived, which is a handy skill in business, but a terrible habit in a family that keeps score with smiles. And I can hear a chorus of sensible people saying, "Why didn't you stop? Why didn't you say no? Why didn't you turn your back?" And my answer will disappoint you because it is not heroic. I love them, and love with a spine still bends when you have been taught since childhood that you are easier to love when you are useful. When Jake lost his partial scholarship after the first year, because training schedules have a way of devouring study time and consequences, our parents told the story with a brave face about how the administration was unfair and the professors didn't understand real life, and there was an evening in their kitchen with unpaid bills half tucked under the fruit bowl where Dad explained, in the reasonable tone men use when they want to put a bow on a bad decision, that families carry each other. And of course they would cover everything because Jake needed to stay focused, while Mom touched my wrist and asked if I could, front the first tuition installment just to keep late fees off the record, because banks are heartless. And I said yes like a fool who believed in a later thank you, and I wired the money to my father's account because the bursar's office closes at 5 and Pride closes earlier, and I learned a small lesson I pretended was a big one. Gratitude evaporates faster than cash. I built my business the way people build stubborn houses in wind country, not glamorous at first and not bragged about at family dinners where success is measured in visible markers like jackets with embroidered school crests and reserved tables at steakhouses. And while Dad practiced speeches about my brother's potential, I practiced quiet, which, if you have never tried it, is a brutal sport when you want to stand up and say, "This is nonsense," and it is also expensive, because quiet people are the ones who pay to keep the noise going. I paid for textbooks that arrived in my mailbox because the online address got messed up somehow. I paid for the emergency brake job before a road trip he insisted on taking. I paid for a summer class that never made it into the stories because stories run smoother when the rough edges are sanded down to a soft glow. People ask whether I ever got even, and they expect fireworks, but the truth is that small, deliberate acts taste better than explosions. Last year, when the company finally crossed a line I had promised myself in a studio apartment with a stubborn thermostat, I set up a scholarship at my old college, a quiet fund in my mother's maiden name for young women who have been told they are too much. Too serious, too cold, the kind of girls who remind people of a closed door, and I wrote the criteria. Myself so that somewhere a dean with a decent heart will feel a tap on his conscience when he signs, and I made sure the award letter uses a sentence I needed at 18. Not congratulations, but we see what you carried. No one at this table knows it exists. And I plan to keep it that way, because not all revenge needs an audience to count. The restaurant tonight smells like butter and old money, the kind that lives on in framed photographs and in the way men speak to waiters when they think their wives are not listening. And my mother radiates that anxious delight she reserves for rooms where she may be photographed, and my father, in a blazer he would never admit he bought with reward points, holds forth on the value of grit while forgetting every instance in which grit looked like me driving across state lines to sign for a package that required a relative, and Jake, flushed and pleased, taps his glass with a butter knife because he truly believes the world is clapping for him and not for the picture they have rehearsed to the point of muscle memory. I play along because the game is old and I know its rules better than anyone, though I do allow myself a petty flourish that no one will clock as a move. When the champagne list arrives and the waiter hovers with that deferential patience that means the bottle has a comma in the price, I ask in a voice so calm it could butter toast if we might put the toasting wine on the host's tab and designate the check in his name for the celebration plaque, and the waiter, who has probably seen worse. Knife fights disguised as etiquette, nods and writes Richard on the line with a fountain pen, and I feel a small bell ring inside me, not because he will pay, which he planned to do anyway, but because the label on the bill will tell the truth about who demanded the applause. So when Dad lifts that glass and delivers his line like a man signing a monument to the only child worth being proud of, I do not flinch or correct or create a scene, because scenes are for people who need witnesses, and I am done auditioning. Instead, I look at Mark, who has spent years learning the topography of my silences the way a careful driver learns the curve of a cliff road, and he leans back with that patient, almost kindly posture that makes arrogant men underestimate him, slips a neat envelope from the inner pocket of his jacket as if he were about to hand over concert tickets, and says, with a smile so courteous it could be mistaken for gratitude, that it is funny, "You did not say that while cashing her checks." Which is the moment the forks stop moving, the waiter stops pretending not to listen, my mother's fingers freeze around a linen napkin, my brother blinks like a man whose eyes are adjusting to harsh daylight, and my father's mouth makes the shape of a word. Without landing on one, while I sit very still and let the room tilt toward the truth, and as Mark lays the envelope by the bread plate with the quiet finality of a judge setting down a verdict, I feel something settle in my chest that has been rattling there since childhood. A feeling that might be called justice if justice did not taste so much like steel. When people ask how a family ends up with one child polished like a trophy and the other wrapped in a plain dish towel, I tell them to follow the money and the stories told about that money. Because somewhere between a bursar's deadline and a Sunday lunch after church the facts go missing and the myths get embroidered, and if you keep your eyes on the invoices rather than the speeches you will see exactly who is carrying whom and who gets credit for the weight. In our case the trail begins the week Jake's scholarship snapped like an old rubber band, when the coach started calling his potential a factor without specifying what it factored into, and Dad started talking in that managerial tone he uses for other men's mistakes, saying that bureaucrats don't respect grit and that the school would hear from him, while Mom set out a Costco sheet cake on a paper tablecloth that tried to look like linen and told me with a small apologetic smile that late fees were cruel and that families close ranks in hard times, a phrase that sounds like solidarity until you realize it means the quiet child pays the bill. I had already learned from FAFSA forms that ask you to disclose everything except the contents of your soul, and from professors who answer emails at 3 in the morning because they live their lives inside fluorescent hours, how quickly a made-up deadline turns into a real penalty. So I wired the tuition gap to Dad's account with the subject line semester coverage and told myself it was a one-time fix, a bandage on a bruise that would fade. It did not fade. And the bruise multiplied. Because once you become the person who can move money faster than other people can move excuses, your phone rings every time the car inspection fails. The landlord raises rent in a college town, because everyone does. The health insurance deductible resets at the worst possible moment, and the registrar locks a portal because a balance sits there like a stone daring someone to lift it, and every time I lifted it, Dad's thank yous arrived shaped like instructions, which is to say they did not arrive at all. I told myself I was investing in peace, because peace at a distance has a price, and paying it kept me away from those tight dinners where Mom arranged her best opinions like centerpiece flowers and Dad explained to the waiter that a man in a blazer deserves refills without asking, which always made my pulse climb in a way that no amount of yoga apps can fix. So I paid for the set of textbooks that got shipped to my address by accident, and for the used Honda that needed a brake job after a road trip that was supposed to be a cheap celebration and turned into a repair invoice, and for the 2 summer classes that did not fit into the glossy family narrative, because glossy narratives prefer scholarships that never slip, coaches who never hedge, and sons who never need their sisters, and every time I pressed submit on an ACH transfer I imagined I was buying 1 more month of quiet. It is not as if Jake was a villain, which would have made my choice simpler, because villains make it easier to say no. He was the kind of charming you get from being told since childhood that doors open when you approach. A nice smile and an easy laugh and the ability to call me kiddo even though I am older and keep 3 calendars in my head without looking away from a conversation. And when he thanked me it was with an awkward hug that smelled like gym laundry and apologetic beer. Which almost worked because it was honest in its smallness, and then he would call Dad to say how much pressure he was under and how the world expected too much, and Dad would repeat that the world is unfair to men who build things. A sentence so odd in our family that I kept it to roll around on my tongue when I needed to remind myself I did not imagine their stories. Somewhere in the middle of that long, expensive stretch I decided that if I was paying for truth to be hidden then I would also pay for a few truths to be engraved. And I do not mean public shaming, because public shaming is messy and often lands on the wrong heads. I mean small and precise corrections, the kind of moves that alter the record without lighting it on fire. So when the internship that Dad swore he had lined up through a friend's friend dissolved into silence, I sent Jake's portfolio to a recruiter I knew from a client project, not as a favor, but as a professional submission with a neutral note, and when the offer came through with a small referral bonus attached, I redirected that bonus to the scholarship fund I had set up in my mother's maiden name for young women who are told they are too much and too serious, and when Dad asked, later and casually, if I had been involved, I said the words men love to hide behind company policy and watched the conversation die like a moth in a porch light. Mark knew every piece of this, not because I poured it out like a confession, but because he reads the margins where I write to myself with a pencil and because he has sat through enough family events to recognize the choreography of my silence. And when he asked, months before this dinner, whether I wanted the ledger clean or the story straight, I told him I wanted both, and he said those are not the same thing, but they can rhyme if you are patient. Patience for me looks like spreadsheets with color codes and a calendar reminder that repeats once a year at tax time, which is how a set of notarized summaries of transfers, labeled cleanly and kept with the accountant's contact, came to exist in a folder that lived between our passports and the warranty for the washing machine, and how a scheduled email, reviewed twice, attached with year-by-year totals, copied to the accountant who files for my parents and sent from an address that none of them have ever noticed, was set to go out at 9 o'clock tonight, the usual dessert hour when people are most sentimental and least prepared to read numbers that contradict their favorite stories. So when Dad lifted his glass and declared his masterpiece line, and the table obliged him with applause, and Mark leaned back with that calm that looks like courtesy until it doesn't, I felt my phone buzz softly against my hip as the scheduled message left our drafts and slid into their inboxes with the quiet authority of a bank lock clicking shut, and I let myself consider, for the span of one inhalation, whether this counted as revenge or simply an audit written in a language my father respects. And then the light from Dad's screen hit his face with that blue tint people get when reality arrives electronically, and Mom's purse chimed like a guilty canary. And Jake frowned at the subject line as if the words would reorganize themselves if he glared long enough, while Mark reached inside his jacket for the envelope that would match the email line by line. And I folded my napkin slowly so my hands would not shake as the room pivoted, almost imperceptibly, from celebration to reckoning. Because the truth had been invited to dinner, and it had just found its seat. The restaurant where everything finally cracked open was one of those places that tries to make you forget it used to be a warehouse, with bricks exposed for authenticity and servers who move like stagehands in a play about money. There were candles on the tables and a pianist whose smile was fixed like a logo, and by the time we arrived, my mother had already called twice to make sure they had this special graduation dessert, as if sugar could turn decades of imbalance into celebration. Mark and I sat across from my parents and Jake, and the arrangement felt mathematical, 2 on each side of the table, symmetry disguising the fracture line running right through the middle. I had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to protect myself, a kind of armor in silk. When you've been cast as the responsible one your entire life, you learn to use polish as camouflage, and I knew that no matter how expensive my shoes were, my father would still find a way to make me invisible under the gleam of Jake's future. He started almost immediately, talking about Jake's grit, about how not everyone can pull themselves up after losing a scholarship and still finish strong. As if the unpaid invoices and quiet transfers that made that possible had been fairy dust instead of my bank account. Every word was delivered with the confidence of a man who had rewritten the past so often he could no longer tell which version was true. Mark, ever the patient observer, let him talk. He has a habit of looking calm even when he's memorizing every detail of an unfolding disaster. He smiled politely while my father told a story about how he had guided Jake through tough times, and I could see my mother watching me from across the table, silently pleading with her eyes that I wouldn't ruin the performance. Families like ours depend on silence as much as they depend on oxygen. Without it, the whole illusion suffocates. The waiter arrived with the wine list, and my father chose the second most expensive bottle because real power, in his mind, is pretending you don't need to look at the price. The conversation rolled forward like a slow train. You could see the wreck coming, but there was nowhere to step aside. Jake leaned back, relaxed, talking about his new job, about making it on his own, and I almost laughed because nothing in that sentence was real. But I didn't. I had promised myself I wouldn't. I was tired of being the emotional custodian of people who never noticed the work it took to keep them upright. When the appetizers came, the pianist switched to something softer, and I thought of every dinner before this one, birthdays where Jake blew out candles and Dad made speeches about family legacy, while my achievements were reduced to polite footnotes. I remembered the day I told them I'd started my own company, and Dad said, "Well, that's cute, but are you sure you can handle that kind of stress?" As if success were something reserved for men with his last name. I let the memory dissolve into the dim light and looked at Mark, who met my gaze with that small, knowing expression that said, "Just wait." Dessert arrived, chocolate, something with gold flakes, the kind of thing you order to prove you can. The waiter poured the last of the wine, and my father stood, slow and deliberate, the way preachers rise before they bless a crowd. He cleared his throat, raised his glass, and said, "To Jake, our pride, our proof that hard work pays off. To the only child worth being proud of." He said it with such certainty that even the air paused, and the table broke into applause as if on cue. My mother clapped too, smiling with the brittle enthusiasm of someone pretending she hadn't heard the insult embedded in the praise. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I just looked at Mark, who leaned back in his chair, stretching one arm along the backrest in a gesture that looked casual but wasn't. His voice was calm, steady, almost conversational when he said, "Funny, you didn't say that while cashing her checks." It was like a tiny stone dropped into still water. The ripple started small, but you could feel it spreading. My father froze, glass still raised midair. My mother's hand tightened on her napkin, twisting it until it looked like rope. Jake blinked, confused, his mouth half open as if the words had come in a language he didn't understand. Mark reached inside his jacket, slow enough for everyone to follow the motion, and pulled out a neat white envelope. He laid it on the table, right next to my father's plate, and for a moment no one breathed. The pianist kept playing, oblivious, as if the soundtrack to our undoing was supposed to be a love song. "You might recognize the handwriting on the transfers," Mark said, his tone almost gentle, like a teacher giving a quiet correction. "They're all dated and labeled. Tuition, rent, car repair. Funny how memory works, isn't it?" The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was the heavy, echoing kind that makes people shift in their seats just to hear something move. My father didn't reach for the envelope. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what was inside. His face went pale, the practiced confidence draining out of him until he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. My mother whispered his name once softly, but he didn't answer. Jake looked between us like a child at the wrong table, trying to understand the game when the rules have already changed. I kept my hands folded in my lap, feeling every second stretch longer than the one before it. This was not triumph. It was something colder, quieter, and far more final. For years, I had imagined what it would feel like for the truth to stand up and introduce itself in front of them, and now that it had, I realized revenge isn't a shout, it's a steady voice that no one can interrupt. Mark didn't gloat, didn't raise his tone, didn't say another word. He simply pushed his glass forward, took a sip, and let the silence finish what he had started. The forks had stopped moving, the pianist shifted to another tune, and the waiter, poor man, froze halfway between tables, sensing the kind of tension that tips don't fix. My father finally lowered his glass, his fingers trembling just enough for me to notice, and said, almost inaudibly, "Let's not ruin the evening." But it was too late. The evening was already in ruins. The applause had died, and the only sound left was the faint clinking of melting ice against crystal, marking the seconds it took for decades of denial to collapse into the simple, undeniable weight of truth. The moment after Mark's sentence landed hung over the table like the last second before a glass hits the floor, a suspended instant where everyone pretends that gravity could be negotiated if they just stayed very still, and in that hush I could hear the soft, relentless piano, the tiny rasp of the candle, the waiter's careful breath as he pretended to be invisible, until my father, who has always preferred bold declarations to difficult facts, lowered his glass with a measured dignity that would have played nicely on a stage and said, in a voice pitched for reasonableness rather than apology, that families help each other and that we do not itemize love, which would have been moving if the envelope by his bread plate did not contain page after page of itemization with memo lines that read tuition shortfall and late rent and brake rotors and that year's premium. Entries no poet would mistake for the soundtrack of parental generosity. He tried to pivot, because that is his favorite dance, telling Mark that private matters should remain private, that this was supposed to be a night for celebration, and that there was no need to embarrass Jake who, by the way, had worked incredibly hard to get here. While Jake looked between us with a hurt, baffled expression that might have asked how the ocean could be wet, and my mother, who has always positioned herself as the peacekeeper while tirelessly setting the table for conflict, reached for my hand under the linen and whispered my name as if she could pull me back inside the script through a well-timed stage direction, except that the script had been replaced with a ledger and the curtain would not close merely because she wished it would. Mark did not raise his voice or lean forward the way some men do when they believe volume equals truth. He simply tapped the envelope with one finger, a gentle, almost affectionate gesture that somehow made the papers inside feel heavier, and said that receipts were not insults but mirrors, that if the story my father loved to tell about grit and providence were true it would not shatter at the first contact with numbers, and that the transfers matched exactly to the dates the registrar had messaged, the month the lease increased, the week the car failed inspection, a tidy alignment of facts that did not leave much room for revisionist history, while my father's jaw set into that familiar line I have seen since childhood. The one that means he will march straight through a brick wall rather than admit it exists. Jake finally found words and chose the wrong ones, insisting that he never asked me for anything, that if I helped it was because I wanted to, that I, being financially comfortable, would not miss what I gave. A neat bit of logic that has lubricated a million small thefts inside families, and for a second I felt the old reactive heat rise up, the teenage urge to inventory every compromise, Every midnight drive, every balance meant minutes before a penalty. Yet instead of unloading the museum of my quiet labor onto the table, I breathed and said, in a tone I reserve for contracts, that I had never asked for thanks, only for accuracy, and that accuracy should not be considered cruelty just because it refuses to dress itself in flattery. My mother, sensing the room tilt toward something irreversible, attempted to rebrand the evening as a memory in progress, saying perhaps we could put this aside until tomorrow, that emotions were high and wine made old wounds louder. That the pianist was playing our song from a long-ago anniversary, which was either true or a clever appropriation of background noise. But Mark, who knows my thresholds and has been watching this family mythology collect interest for years, simply slid the top printout toward my father so that the highlighter marks caught the light, and the name on the receiving account sat there in block letters that could not be sweet-talked into someone else's. Which is when my father pushed his chair back a fraction, and the legs made a scraping sound that startled the table behind us, where a couple paused in the ritual of a proposal and looked over with rings still in the air. The manager, a professional diplomat in a suit almost too tight across the shoulders, materialized with the kind of smile people wear when walking into a room that might explode, asking if everything was to our liking and whether we might enjoy the complimentary celebration plate, and it would have been easy to wave him away, to keep drowning in the swamp of our own history. But I had laid the groundwork in the quietest possible way during a bathroom break when the evening still pretended to be benign, pressing a folded note with a neat tip into the captain's hand and asking if the pastry chef could write a specific phrase in chocolate as a small private joke, a favor that required no explanation to anyone not seated at our table. And now, as if on cue, 4 dessert plates arrived, each a dark, glossy, perfect circle carrying 2 words in careful script, paid in full, followed by a smaller line the staff had copied exactly as I wrote it, for Jake, with love from the sister who carried the difference. No one touched a fork, partly because my father had gone very still and partly because the room had learned there are certain sentences you do not interrupt with sugar. And for a single long heartbeat, I felt the mean little lift of triumph that accompanies a well-executed plan, then the complicated ache that follows, because victory over a lie does not return the years you lost to it, though it does, if you are lucky. Stop the bleeding. The manager cleared his throat and set down the leather folder for the bill, and, because I had arranged the reservation under the host designation earlier with the simple insistence that the plaque read his name, the smallest honesty in a night devoted to restoring proportion. The check printed Richard in bold above the total, along with the customary line the restaurant uses when a party requests a commemorative inscription, a line I had asked them to personalize, in honor of hard work, underwritten by family. A phrasing so polite that only those of us at the table could feel the sting. My father reached for the folder and then stopped, hand hovering, perhaps calculating the cost in both currencies, money and face, perhaps deciding whether to double down on the toast or retreat to the safety of silence. When the second shoe from my careful wardrobe dropped with the soft chiming cruelty of good timing, phones buzzing in chorus, as the scheduled email I had queued earlier, the accountant's summary with year-by-year transfers and clean totals, reached both my parents and, by the grace of autofill, the accountant who files for them, who replied instantly with one of those efficient messages that reads like a verdict, acknowledging receipt, asking whether reclassification was required for prior returns. And CCNG, a man I recognized as my father's oldest colleague, the one who prides himself on compliance. Jake stood so suddenly his chair rocked backward and had to be caught by the waiter, his face a collage of anger and embarrassment, accusing us of sabotaging his night, saying this was petty and cruel and unnecessary, that we could have handled it privately, which would have been an excellent suggestion 5 years ago, and then he walked out through the maze of tables with the kind of swagger that looks like confidence until you see the speed, while my mother's napkin twisted into a white rope. And my father, whose kingdom had been a story all along, sat with the bill he had insisted on paying and the desserts he could not swallow and the envelope he could not deny, and I, who have never been good at victory laps, lifted my glass of water instead of the wine, because clarity seemed an appropriate drink, and watched the surface settle from the ripples. There is a commonly repeated bit of advice that says you should never meet cruelty at its volume, that the quiet move will always land harder because it refuses the theatrics of its opponent. And as the manager returned with the receipt for a signature and a tasteful congratulations card for Jake that, by request, bore the pre-printed line paid by the host, I signed my own name across the pastry ticket for the custom chocolate work and slipped an additional donation receipt underneath it. The restaurant's charity partner accepts on-the-spot contributions for scholarships tied to hospitality training, and I had arranged, again in my mother's maiden name, a matching gift to be made in my father's honor and sent to his office with a certificate noting that the donor requested anonymity. Then I closed the folder, thanked the staff with the softness they had earned, and stood with Mark as my mother whispered that this would break the family if I didn't stop, while I thought, not for the first time, that sometimes you need to break the frame to save the picture, and that the most elegant revenge is a simple correction printed where everyone involved is required to read it. In the weeks after the dinner that split our family into before and after, the silence rolled in not like a clean break, but like fog that keeps returning each morning even when the sun makes promises. And while my phone stayed mostly quiet except for the obligatory holiday sale texts and the algorithm's cheerful insistence that I might like recipes for sheet pan optimism, the world around my parents adjusted to the new gravity with the slow inevitability of furniture marks left on a carpet. Because once the accountant had replied all with his bright, tidy request about reclassification and prior returns, and once the colleague with whom my father has traded stories about ethics for 3 decades sent a one-line message that simply read, "Call me," the private myth collapsed into a smaller, less flattering reality that could not be smoothed by brisk walks or favorite hymns, and within that shrinking space my mother developed a new habit of forwarding church newsletters as if verses could be used like duct tape, while my father stopped posting from the golf course and started arriving at his office earlier than the cleaning crew, the kind of retreat that looks like discipline until you see the corners. Jake called once, late, when bravado is cheapest and honesty is most likely to wander out half-dressed, and he said the word sabotage with the righteous energy of a man who has never reconciled the bill for his own luck. And I let him talk until he ran out of air, then said, in the same voice I use when a vendor claims a deadline is a suggestion, that truth is not sabotage, and that if he wanted to keep his story, he should try choosing one that didn't require other people to subsidize the plot. And I waited for the explosion that used to come in our 20s when he still believed volume could bully facts, but instead he went quiet and then asked the question I had not prepared for, which was whether I thought he could start over without the scaffolding he'd grown accustomed to, and the part of me that still collects the pieces no one else bothers to see almost said of course, and I will help draw the blueprint. Yet the grown woman who has carried quiet like a second spine told the truth. That matters more than money, that starting over is a choice, and that no one can hand it to him like an engraved set of steak knives. And when the line went dead, I sat in the kitchen with the lights off, and the hum of the refrigerator making a thin, faithful sound. And I let myself feel what victory actually feels like when the person opposite you is not a cartoon villain, but your brother. You get your breath back, but the room does not immediately smell sweeter. Mark, who considers kindness a strategy as much as a virtue, kept the house steady by cooking too much pasta and leaving absurd notes on the sugar jar, yet he also asked me the question I had been avoiding, which was whether I wanted recompense or repair. Because receipts can force one and never guarantee the other, and I told him that I didn't want my father's money returned like a grudging refund from a store that sold me a defective narrative. I wanted the ledger of credit rewritten in a way that could not be erased the next time a story needed a hero, and because he knows that my preferred weapons are paper and time, he nodded and said then we would write the ending in a place that prints in ink. My mother sent, without comment, a single envelope addressed in her careful script, and inside was a check for the exact total of the transfers over those years alongside a note that said, "Consider a square." A sentence that pretends moral mathematics is as simple as subtraction, and I understood in a sudden, almost physical way that cashing it would let my father close the file and tell himself he had restored order, so I did a small stubborn thing that cost nothing and meant everything. I wrote void in neat block letters and tucked the paper into a folder with the rest of the documentation, not to keep score, but to prevent the score from being rewritten by the same hand that had miscounted in the first place. And then, because revenge without purpose curdles fast, and I have no interest in turning bitter when I could turn useful, I called the development office at the university and finalized an anonymous endowment that had been waiting in the wings since before the dinner. A women's persistence grant in my mother's maiden name with a stipulation that award letters would be mailed to both the recipient and a designated family witness. A small ceremonial flourish that ensures at least one kitchen table each year. Here's the sentence I needed at 18. We see what you carried. The clever part, the part that made even Mark whistle when I told him, was the placement, because universities love plaques and my father loves ceremonies. So I arranged for the dedication to sit not in a quiet office, but along the corridor leading to the alumni dining room where he attends luncheons and pretends the past is tidy. A modest brushed metal plate that reads, for the students told they are too much, too intense, too cold, may your work speak loudly, and below it, simply endowed by the W.M. Fund, which means nothing to the casual passerby and everything to anyone who knows that those are my mother's initials, and that the maiden name he worked so hard to bury under his own has a way of resurfacing when truth requires a lifeline. On the day the plaque went up, the development office sent courtesy photos to designated contacts, which included the donors and, per my stipulation, one household address, and when the email confirmation arrived that the packet had been signed for with my father's signature, and that the alumni magazine had slotted a 3-paragraph item into the upcoming issue, I felt the strange relief of having moved the battle from our table to the record, where my preferred victories live. There were ripples, of course. The accountant handled the reclassification with the brisk relief of a professional who enjoys clean lines, which resulted in a modest penalty that irritated my father's pride more than his wallet and Jake. Perhaps because he finally sat alone long enough to hear himself without applause, sent a short message that did not ask for help but asked for advice, and I said something that sounded like a platitude and felt like a boundary, that he could call me when he had drafted a plan with dates and responsibilities that did not include me as guarantor, and then I put the phone face down and let the quiet do its work, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a grown man is refuse to carry him another step. Weeks later, in the corridor outside the alumni dining room where the carpet is always too thick and the air smells like lemon polish and endorsements, I stood in front of the plaque alone after a client meeting in the city and looked at the words I had chosen on a cold afternoon when I decided that my anger would pay rent or it would be evicted, and I thought about the night of the dinner, about desserts that no one tasted and a bill that printed a name and a truth together on one small slip of paper, and I wondered if breaking the frame had saved the picture or just revealed the water damage underneath, because families do not dissolve with a single confrontation, they fray and knot and sometimes come back in shapes you don't recognize. And as I turned to leave, I caught a reflection in the glass, my father at the far end of the hall, alone, reading the plaque with the careful, punishing attention he usually reserves for contracts, his face unreadable from that distance, his hand hovering as if he might reach out and touch the metal to test whether it was real, and my first impulse was to wait for him to look up so we could perform either a truce or another battle, yet I didn't move, because I am done auditioning for roles that flatten me. And I walked past without forcing a scene, leaving him with the words and myself with the question that will probably never close neatly. When the record finally tells the truth, is that justice, or is justice the quiet you choose afterward? The kind that leaves enough space for someone else to decide who they are without your money holding up the ceiling. And when my phone vibrated in my pocket with a new message, his name on the screen, no preview, just the promise of a conversation that could tilt either way, I let it ring once, twice, and then I answered, because ambiguity is not avoidance, and some endings, the ones you can live with, arrive without applause and without a verdict. Just the knowledge that you stood your ground, and that, for now, the ledger reads exactly what happened.